Hello, Bungers of the world. This is BungaCast. Welcome back. It's Sunday, the 4th of September. My name is Alex Okin, and I'm here with George Hoare. George is shortly going to be talking to someone about La Macronie, Macronistan, and the wider convulsions in France. Listeners might want to check out recent episodes if you want some further background and further discussion of France and the elections. We have an episode with Chris Bickerton, which is episode 257. And episode 256 as well with Charles Devellennes, which discuss some background to the recent election before the second round, which Macron, of course, won. He and his allies, however, did not win in the legislative elections in June, which we didn't have a dedicated episode on. They gained only 42% of the seats in the National Assembly. So some of what you're going to hear now is going to be a little bit more context to that. George, why don't you tell us who we're going to be talking to, or you're going to be talking to?
So I'm discussing all of these things and more with Nathan Sperber, who's an independent researcher on political economy based in Paris and the author of a recent piece in American Affairs, Muddling Through in Macronia, How Populism and the Establishment Intertwine. And that's on many things that we discussed, so the political economy of France and the longer term prospects of Macron and Macronia. And listeners should also listen to an episode on the Gilets jaunes back at episode 64. So quite a bit of an old one, but some of that, the context, because we do discuss that quite a bit as well. But I hope that people get something out of this interview.
So just quickly before we do that, you need to explain to people, George, what is a cassoulet? Because I think this is important terminology.
Right. Yeah. So a cassoulet is a delicious French stew, which if listeners haven't made for themselves, go and treat yourself. It's it's
a white bean stew from the Southwest. Yeah,
I think it's a southern rich dish, and this will become relevant in the context of the interview. I haven't had one in ages.
It's like a feijoada, but a white bean feijoada. But I'm a big fan.
It's peasant food, but also
you say that with such distaste, Phil.
I'm not saying it with distaste, but George said it's very rich, but it has a lot in it, but it's not, it's classic kind of peasant kind of stew essentially, and there's different variations in different countries. But also, I just like our listeners, because you need quite a few ingredients to make a cassoulet work, and it might be difficult given the current problems that people might be confronting with food inflation. So
the food,
I'm just indicating the fact that I have concern for the plight of the masses.
Right.
I'm not just kind of spaffing off about the expensive dishes they can make for themselves.
There is a term in French for something which is just fills you up, and étouffe chrétien. Or étouffe chrétienne. I probably got my accordance wrong there, but anyway, it's like French Christian stuffing, or stuff the Christians. I don't know. Anyway, I'm going to stop babbling. Here's George talking to Nathan.
So yeah, just to jump straight in, before we were recording, you were saying that Macron has been talking for a long time that we're facing the end of abundance, this kind of the easy times are over. Why has he been developing this leitmotif for such a long time?
Well, this is an interesting... It symbolizes the broader change in Macron's rhetoric since his first election in 2017. Mm-hmm. In that, at the time, most of his discourse was on a hopeful, neoliberal, entrepreneurial note. But at the same time, even at that time, he started mentioning occasionally what he called the return of the tragic.
Okay.
Which will resonate with the viewers of your podcast who are so interested in the issue of history and the end of history. The return of the tragic, as in the return of shortages, geopolitical tension, and preparing the population for some kind of unspecified sacrifice coming up in a new world order. So Macron was occasionally mentioning this before the coronavirus, but nobody really picked it up, and he wasn't saying this that often.
So he was ahead of the times.
In a sense, he was laying the ground for something that he would be ready to exploit a lot more after the pandemic, and even more so after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And as a result of this theme, or this trope, if you will, of coming disorder, return of the tragic, potential sacrifices, which was a more peripheral theme in his discourse before 2020 came in much more center stage now.
Okay.
Hence the end of abundance message.
That's his. He can sell that periodization to the European public, but I think I prefer the end of history as a way to understand our current age, not the age of the end of abundance. But yeah, no. So just I guess to move on to the American Affairs article, which is the main thing we're discussing. You start this off by grouping in like the dangerous decade, the Macron's destruction of the French party system, Brexit and Trump, and this period of this year between June 2016 and June 2017 as an epochal one. So can you just briefly recap for listeners, how did Macron and his movement, his party, come to power?
Well, he came to power in 2017 in an event that was not only his personal triumph, but it was also at the same time the collapse of the two-party system that had existed in France since the 80s or so, in the sense that for several decades, typically control of government would switch from one party to the next, meaning on the left, the Socialist Party, which had by the mid-80s become very moderate and accommodative with capitalism, and on the right, the various iterations of the historical Gaullist Party that had been created in support of de Gaulle more than half a century ago. So there was this alternation of power between center-left and center-right for decades. And Macron in 2017, benefiting from, on the one hand, a very deep and intensifying discontent within the electorate towards the political status quo, and on the other hand, benefiting from sheer luck, in the sense that the center-left candidate was representing a discredited socialist party after Hollande's presidency, and the center-right candidate was mired in corruption allegations. Macron just swooped in a kind of blitzkrieg, and ended up in the second round of the 2017 election against a far-right candidate. And from then on, the lesser of two evils logic applied to most of the electorate that was not, say, ready to cast a vote in support of the far right. And Macron became French president in a very sudden event that would be hard to imagine in, say, the US or the UK, where the steady alternation between two parties has, in fact, despite everything, remained incredibly resilient for a century or so, or even more.
So he saw a gap in the market, showed great entrepreneurialism, get up and go.
Exactly.
And he took that opportunity. I guess so. You were sort of talking there about the two main parties, these having contributing to his good luck through their various failings. But I mean, do you think this? Would you say this is a broader change in French politics? This was a moment of the replacement of parties with personalised movements, and this is the new normal for French politics.
This encapsulates some of the change that has happened in, say, party politics. What is interesting with what happened in 2017 with Macron's election is that France's political sphere was in complete disarray. Both establishment parties were routed, and most of their politicians were simply out of the game. A new party came. So party politics in France was completely upended and radically transformed, or if you will, revolutionized. But this revolution was truly confined to the sphere of day-to-day political life, or party politics, let us say, without changing that much in the rest of the country. But the way, to come back to your point, the way party politics operates in France did undergo an inflection in 2017, not only in the advent of Macron's presidency, but also in the fact that from this point on, it became clear that more individualized, personalized political ventures, whether you call them parties or movement, or personal parties or personal movements, or charismatic movements, seem to become more successful, as compared to parties that had existed for a long time, were more institutionalized and were not necessarily associated with one charismatic leader at all times, meaning the Socialist Party and the neo-Gaullist right. These older movements were taken out of the game. In a sense, they lost the competition not only to Macron, but to a new force on the left, which was La France Insoumise, or Unbowed France.
France.
If you want to translate this,
insouciant France,
unsubmissive, non-submissive France. And that movement was also a new kind of political entity that proclaimed, we are not a party, we are a movement, which was a way at the same time to insulate the top of the party from a broader militant base, but also to justify the fact that only one individual, in fact, completely represented or spoke for the movement.
Mélenchon.
Which was Mélenchon.
No, it'd be good to get into that particular movement in a bit more detail in a bit. But I guess another bit of context in the article before you kind of move into the political economy of it, and also what Macron or Macronia represents, is France's long simmering crisis. So what are the key? I mean, long simmering sounds like a slow cooked dish. So not to extend the metaphor too much, but what are the main ingredients in this cassoulet of disruption and crisis?
Right, exactly. Well, France is a pessimistic society to start with, and an interesting thing in France, perhaps, which is different to other Western countries, is that the sense that we as French are steeped in crisis is a kind of common sense that has become dominant in France, not in very recent decades, but in fact since the 70s. So I remember going into school in France in the 90s, and our history classes would basically tell us that we were, as a country, in a crisis since the oil shock of 1973.
Right.
And which can be explained in the fact that France's economy and growth rates were pretty remarkably high for European countries in the 50s and 60s, and then really declined to a rather tepid economic performance from the 70s onwards, with rising unemployment. So for this reason, by the 90s or 2000s, France was considered by its own public and by the French electorate itself to be in a very unenviable position of poor economic performance and long-term crisis. As in, our days and our generation is doing worse than the post-war generation. Whereas I suppose in the UK, part of the electorate that would have been more sensitive to Thatcherite discourse would in fact believe that there had been a kind of reinvigoration of the nation in the 80s, or through Cool Britannia or New Labour or whatever. This sense of hopefulness, however fleeting and misguided, never really existed in France. So in the 90s and 2000s. So hence the long simmering crisis thing.
No, I think it's interesting because in the UK there was a mid 70s crisis where there wasn't enough. The grave diggers were on strike, and so there were bodies piled up, and there was nobody taking away the trash, and that was one crisis. Then there was some disagreement between. This is like the stereotypical version of British history that I'm trying to remember from sort of primary school. Then there was some sort of disagreement between Thatcher and the miners about something or other, but that didn't really represent a crisis. And then there was the Falklands War, which was a great British military victory. And then there was Cool Britannia and Euro '96. So the story was one of endless optimism since the mid '70s. So very different to the pessimistic French story. But yeah, so just to bring it, I guess, to the present day, the Gilets jaunes, who we've talked about a lot on this podcast, and COVID, which we've also talked about a lot in this podcast. What's the kind of your take on these additional, more recent layers to the French picture and self description as a nation of crisis?
Right. Well, the link to from the, say, long-term chronic sense of pessimism within the French public since the 1970s and the more recent political upheaval of the 2010s, such as the Gilets jaunes, and even, in a way, Macron's own election, would be the repercussions of the 2008 financial crisis. And in this sense, France's crisis became more synchronous in the 2010s with that of other Western countries. So when the 2008 financial crisis came about, the most common interpretation in France was that this was just a new layer of crisis on top of a very poor situation to begin with. And it is true that things did get worse after 2008 for France, as in other Western European countries. There was a recession. There was some degree of fiscal austerity, not as bad as under Cameron in the UK, but still rising unemployment, and essentially a complete failure of the political class and of incumbent governments to respond to this in a way different than fiscal retrenchment and cutting on redistribution and with very little stimulus. So essentially, growth remained more or less at zero from the early 2010s to the late 2010s. And this is the context that explains the widespread discontent against the political class that in turn makes sense of Macron's success in 2017. And it is also the context that explains the Gilets jaunes, the Yellow Vest protests of 2018.
So what's the link there? Just that this is low growth rates lead to a feeling of complete dissatisfaction with the political class, which lead to people putting on yellow vests and protesting against increasing fuel costs because there's no faith that the political class have any degree of responsiveness, whatever, to popular demands.
Right, but people do not protest against growth rates, but they protest against the effect that low growth rates and economic stagnation has on their lives, have had on their lives over a certain period of time, after which it becomes obvious that their personal prospects and possibly the prospects of their children seem to them very much worse than what experienced the prior generation. And I think this is what you get with the Gilets jaunes. You get a situation where the national economy hasn't been dynamic at all, but more specifically, medium-sized towns or small-sized towns that are less connected to growth centers, such as large cities, are doing worse than the average in France, have experienced more deindustrialization, which is a common story all over Western Europe, which has happened in France as well. Added to this, the fiscal austerity of the 2010s has resulted in broadly a decline in the quantity and quality of public services, and this in particular in the more remote, less metropolitan areas. So high unemployment, deindustrialization, public services that are increasingly in a state of disrepair, with lowering provision that is on the decline, plus rising costs. In the sense that it's true that today inflation is a hot topic, but even during the 2010s, although nominal inflation was low, some types of items are actually experiencing high inflation. Whether housing, obviously, where house prices, as asset prices go up, more than wages do, but also prices for whether energy, insurance contracts, maintenance, those kinds of expenses that are really hard to do without for, say, the lower middle class, who are the basis of the Gilets jaunes. And for all of this you ended up with a very large number of people in France, let's say the lower middle class and adjacent groups, mostly living outside metropolitan areas, that were simply had an understanding of their own situation that was extremely pessimistic and dark, in the sense that they had reached to a point where they're convinced that everything was going to the worse, for them and for their children.
Yeah.
And becoming in that they had a sense that their own daily lives was becoming increasingly unsustainable as they saw expenses rise more than their wages. So this is the context for the Gilets jaunes.
Yeah. So all of these things put together, basically, the title of the article, Muddling Through in Macronia, is that how you pronounce it? Because obviously this is not a word that I'm...
La Macronie.
La Macronie. So...
Macronia would be the English translation.
Yeah, but this is an English podcast with terrible Anglo pronunciation of any foreign word. So yeah, Macronia?
What is Macronia?
Yeah, what is Macronia? Whence Macronia? With Macronia?
So the word Macronie in French, as in la Macronie, the Macronia, or just Macronia, is used enormously in French political discourse nowadays, and started to be used, I would say, not a long time after Macron's first election in 2017. So the original meaning for Macronia is a way to denote not only Macron but all his associates, allies, friends, supporters, people who depend on him and who,
if you will, his cronies.
His cronies and the cronies of his cronies, and a broader constellation of people who are, let us say, his power block.
So I think
Macronia would mean this. It would mean, and in another meaning that became used in some circle afterwards, Macronia means France under Macron, or the kind of social order that was created in France. For instance, Macron was slapped by a monarchist fringe activist in 2021.
Yeah.
In an incident that was reported, there was a video and so on, because it's not that common for a head of state to be slapped by a member of the general public. And as that fringe monarchist far-right militant slapped Macron, he yelled at him, "À bas la Macronie," down with Macronia. And the sense, as in almost a feudal concept, that he was slapping the representative of an order of things that had to be overcome.
The state, it's him in France today. So okay, because we've discussed, as I said, some of these topics before, including those episodes with Chris and Charles around the time of the French election. But we wanted to take a bit, I guess, of a longer view and a bit more of a focus on political economy in this chat. So you sort of, I guess, the essay is framed around addressing two questions. And the first is around the French states and the EU's as well, post-pandemic embrace of neo-statism. So another way to put this is neoliberalism over? And I think it's fair to say that the hosts of this podcast have probably slightly different approaches to addressing this question. But what's your take on this? Because I guess you talk about Paulo Gabaldo's book, The Great Recoil, and his approach there is that this is the paradigm, like protective neo-statism. The states are turning to high investment and an increased, I guess, feeling of responsibility towards their citizens, and that this is, I don't think Paulo necessarily says this is a good or a bad political development, but just that it's the way in which polities expect, at least in Western Europe, political claims to be made. So yeah, what's your conclusion about neoliberalism in France? Is it over? Is it here to stay? Is it something in between?
Well, my perspective is that this is an important question, and it should be unpacked in more than one way. In the sense that, is neoliberalism over? Well, you could discuss this at the level of political discourse and rhetoric.
Yeah.
You can discuss this at the level of policy. What are the policy plans put forward by governments? And you can discuss this at the level of prevailing economic structures. Are the pre-existing economic structures still reflective of neoliberalism or not?
Yeah.
And then after having unpacked it in this way, you can unpack it further into different realms of economic policy, say industrial policy, welfare policy, trade policy, and so on. So this is a complicated issue, but I think it is an important one. And at least after having unpacked it in this way, the answer for some of the aspects would be yes. And this is also what I try to elaborate on in the article, is that through the pandemic mostly, and through political expediency and decisions of Macron himself, and broader changes in political discourse and atmosphere in society, somehow the neoliberal rhetoric has kind of quit the scene.
Yeah.
Which is worth noting. In terms of
agree.
policy, some policy initiatives indeed seem to be trying to move beyond neoliberalism, but they may face obstacles. And at the same time, broader economic structures and socioeconomic institutions remain very much the product of decades of neoliberal restructuring, as you would expect.
Absolutely, yeah. So I guess just to push you a bit on this, and to defend my own particular approach to this to a certain extent. Now, I think the point about, political discourse, people stopped talking about the need for austerity and started talking about unlimited quantitative easing pretty quickly around the time of COVID. And I think this led some people to conclude that neoliberalism was over, that we had managed to find an agent of history in the virus which had conquered the neoliberals and is going to produce some new variant, if you will, of capitalism. But I think Wolfgang Streeck's approach is much more to focus on essentially what is the relationship between politics and the economy. And I think in this sense that neoliberalism is a process of encasing the economy from political decision making. In this sense, I was going to say the EU when I meant neoliberalism. That's they're not exactly the same thing, but they're obviously related. But in this sense, neoliberalism seems to me to be, if not alive and well, then still certainly not having the last rites read anytime in the immediate future. So yeah, basically, I guess I just wanted to push on this. It's a bit of a rambling question, in fact, but just wanted to push on this a little bit. So, in the French context, is there anything to add around, I guess, any changes in political decision-making structures, any particularly significant policies which are something above and beyond, here is a big number on a giant check that's going to a part of the economy?
Well, my perspective on this is to say that insulating economic policy from, say, democracy or the potential for mass deliberation and decision is not unique to neoliberalism. And as such, the concept of neoliberalism ought to be distinct from that, as having some kind of policy substance.
Yeah.
Because you can insulate planning from democracy. You can insulate various types of economic institutional orders from democracy. And I would say that if, or to the extent that there is a neo-statist turn in France, or even more broadly in Europe, it looks to be rather well insulated from democratic pressures in any case. So it would be a transformation, a revision, and partly simply discarding some neoliberal policy recipes, but that would still very much be in the hands of an elite, and this would be especially so in the case of France, where the technocratic elite and the financial ministry in particular would be the people controlling this, and without any political force at the moment, at least being in power, that would aim to make this a broader, more popular, more democratic process.
So, I mean, do you think they're going to face any challenges from the loss of the neoliberal, there is no alternative justification for policy decisions? I mean, so the way you actually phrase it in the article is fading away as a guiding paradigm. I mean, that's a question mark. in the essay. I mean, if this like set of arguments or set of ways of justifying things is no longer available, is this going to lead to some challenges, some greater obstacles in legitimizing policy directions?
Well, not necessarily. It depends what replaces the rhetoric.
Good point.
There's one understanding whereby neo-statism, whether, say, industrial policy or massive public investment or greater government control over trade or transnational financial flows, that all of this, by putting the actions of government a bit, making it more interventionist and endowing it with more influence over, say, specific economic activity in a more finer-grained way, all of this makes it, say, ripe for politicization, because the public would see that the state has its hands on the economy to a greater extent, although it always had, but to a greater extent than it had before, and therefore the public would be more likely to see economic processes as potentially politicized or open to mass intervention. However, I think it's not enough to just nurture this hope. The fact is that the precise words and rhetoric that substitute for neoliberalism will, in a way, can preclude democratization of the economy in this sense. And what I tried to say in the essay is that, and on this point, on the point of rhetoric, not so much policy or economic institutions, but on a point of rhetoric, there's really something to Paulo Gerbodo's writing. He puts forward what he calls the master signifiers of sovereignty, protection, and control, which are relatively vague, but are increasingly invoked. At least in the case of France, they're increasingly invoked both by Macron himself, which is a contrast from his 2017 more neoliberal entrepreneurial persona, and they are invoked as well by opposition political forces, rather left or right, by both establishment parties, those that survive, and anti-establishment actors, and they're also much more present in say, media or the broader public discourse. So in invoking sovereignty, whereas, say, 10 or 20 years ago, sovereignty was considered a relic, a fossil-like trope that very few political actors would claim for themselves. Now everybody is pro-sovereignty. And so I believe that this kind of rhetoric on sovereignty, protection, will in fact be serve to be the framing of whatever neo-statist policy initiative there is. In relation to a turbulent world, the need to protect and make France more sovereign in a dangerous, turbulent world facing war in Europe, the rise of China, and dangerous viruses, and so on and so forth. And if it is embedded in this kind of rhetoric, you can easily imagine that this will in fact allow persistent technocratic control over this, and little democratization. It's
interesting, right? Because the justification or the need for sovereignty and control and to lesser extent, well, actually, and equally protection, those three things, they're needed because France is vulnerable, because the French people are vulnerable. It's a vulnerability justification of these things. But of course, I'm sure he's not listening to this podcast, but if he were, I would say to Macron, be careful. These concepts, particularly control and sovereignty, can things might get out of hand. You've got to be careful what you suggest to people. I mean, in the Brexit context, obviously this slogan "Take Back Control," which was undeniably very powerful, ended up unleashing some political forces which were very disruptive, to put it mildly, in British politics over the course of many years, and had to be then neutralised with a counter slogan, "Get Brexit Done," which obviously is trying to put the genie back in the bottle, or the contents of Pandora's box back in the box, neither of which of course is possible. But no, I think that kind of leads us a bit onto the forces outside of Macron and the potential anti-establishment movements. And I think this is the second question in the essay, which obviously is related to the first, which is how are the ruling institutions and incumbent elites going to be able to accommodate the ascendancy of anti-establishment movements, are they going to be? Are these movements going to allow themselves to be co-opted, or are they willing to embrace the more radical aspects potentially of their rhetoric? Are they going to tear the whole system down? So who are these actors that I'm alluding to in your view, and what do you think about their co-optability or their appetite for destruction, to put it in that way?
Well, essentially what I'm trying to do in this article is also talking about these anti-establishment forces. Mm-hmm. So in the French context, that would be on the right, the Rassemblement National, former Front National or National Front, the far-right party, led by Marine Le Pen. And on the left, it would be France Insoumise, France Unbowed, led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon. And these two parties existed and in fact grew in prominence in the 2010s. But what I'm trying to do in this article is move beyond the dominant rhetoric since the 2010s of opposing, say, technocrats to populists or nationalists to populists, and perhaps think about the potential for more amalgamation or intermingling between so-called establishment and anti-establishment. So the fact is also that whatever has happened in the past decades, election cycle after election cycle, it is true that the vote share, the aggregate vote share of anti-establishment candidates, so these two parties plus an array of smaller ones, seems to increase inexorably, in a sense, which of course poses the question of what will happen if whether this anti-establishment left or the anti-establishment right or some kind of alliance makes it into government, which is a realistic prospect, whether in 22 or later, and whether it takes the form of these two movements or whether these two movements in fact could transform into other movements. The precise actors that will represent this potential breakthrough into government is uncertain who they will be, but I think it's an important question for the future. And what I suggest is that it would not take the form of a simple collapse or ruin of the establishment. It would be more an uneasy, difficult process of co-optation and intermingling between establishment and anti-establishment elements.
So a kind of France unbowed and on the go kind of model, potentially. What I guess, because we could talk about either one of these two groups for quite a long time, but what's your how would you summarize their appeal? What are they about? So I guess the one particularly sort of interesting question is how they're what are the similarities between France Insoumise and so between Mélenchon and Le Pen as political actors, and between their two movements?
Well, their political platforms are widely divergent. Yeah. So I really find any prospect for an alliance between the two extremely unlikely. Yeah. What they share, of course, is, and have always shared, although it can be seen as rather superficial, is simply a rather virulent criticism of incumbent political elites. And thereby, de facto, they both attract sections of the electorate that are the most alienated and hostile towards the governing class of France. So this, obviously, they have in common. They are very different in origins, since the far-right party actually originates in a group of, say, former Nazi collaborators and nostalgics of French Algeria, whereas the La France Insoumise originates from a left-wing splinter group from the Socialist Party. Yeah, they have very little in common in terms of background and political culture. But they do both mobilize and appeal to the sense that the political order has to be radically overturned, and not only overturning party political life like Macron did, but by overturning the political order, also potentially overturning the socioeconomic order, or So this is what they have in common.
Do you think they're equally co-optable? I guess, this is the question that you sort of, the counter elites on the radical left and radical right, like, are they preparing themselves to be co-opted by the system? Are they looking in a, I guess, more opportunistic way to enter the elite rather than to replace it? To enter the elite rather than to destroy it.
Well, I think so. I think in an interesting way, both these two forces and also the incumbent elite itself increasingly have to accept the prospect of either one of these forces or other anti-establishment element entering government. Mm-hmm. And this is an important point because often strident and mildly successful populist movements or anti-establishment movements, their reasonable prospects is just getting more votes, whether 5, 10, 15% of the vote share, without ever having to seriously prepare themselves for governing, for actually steering the administrative state, which is a formidable task. And this is the point where entering government is becoming a realistic prospect for forces such as these. So this is an interesting change, and I would say that as of now, they are seriously contemplating this. They are contemplating this by also trying to train themselves into how the French administration works, how policy is implemented. They're trying to make contacts or build support networks among high-level civil servants, which in France are a major elite constituency. Yeah. So we might see a process of actually these forces being inducted into, let us say, the practice of government, which is very different from the world of electoral politics in which they have solely been evolving.
So you mentioned high-level civil servants as an important aspect of the French elite, and I actually wanted to just ask you a little bit more about how you think the French elite could be summarised as being structured. But I just wanted to ask which Le Pen or Mélenchon, which would your average high-level civil servant in France be less comfortable with?
I would say, since most higher civil servants in France would have an old, very moderate SOCDEM, social democratic sensibility, a lot of them would find working with the far right extremely loathsome. And although they have no sympathy for Mélenchon, they might possibly still prefer him after all. But it will not be these will not be the people who choose. They will have to deal with whoever.
Yeah, that's. I guess I was just thinking about the civil service in this country and their particular political leanings and distastes, and because I guess it's in. So to move on to the question, I guess part of the reason why I asked that is because your view of the French elite is that this, the French civil service, this is an important pole of the French elite. So how do you see this as structured? And also, I mean, do you think this is this a case of French exceptionalism? Is this the French, the universal class, the civil service in the universal nation of post-revolutionary France? Is this a special case that no other country is able to follow, or is this actually something which in general, we should pay more attention to the role of the civil service and high-level civil servants in constituting the elite?
I'd say both. I'd say that the civil service, wherever, say among Western countries, is one part of the elite that is the general public is least familiar with. Yeah. And this is not a good thing because even if in countries where they are reputed to be quite weak, as in the United States, they do in fact play an important role, and especially when they enter into political conflict or disagreement with the nominal heads of the executive, as happened under the Trump presidency. Yeah. So I do believe that in terms of understanding elites, upper civil servants or administrators are one section of the elite that is too often ignored or overlooked. Now, to come to France, there is, in fact, a French exceptionalism in the sense that the French higher civil service does follow a broader administrative system that endows it with a lot of power, influence, and autonomy to a greater extent than what exists in the UK, and to a very much greater extent to what exists in the US. I think that's an interesting thing if to discuss, let's say, the broader sociology of Western elites. In a sense, the business classes, potentially in different Western countries, are more alike than the administrative classes of these different countries, because the corporate form has essentially overtaken economic life in the globalized West for decades. However, legal models and administrative models of government do bear the hallmarks of a longer-term history and contrast in national traditions of politics. So in this sense, there is simply more room for national exceptionalism in the area of administration and civil service than in other realms.
You could also argue that the business elites in general are more networked and outward-looking with their business dealings and their transnational buy-selling, whereas the administrative elites are, by their nature, much more inward-looking, attending to with the exception of, I guess, foreign offices and externally facing civil servants, attending to the challenges and problems of the nation. So, yeah. If that one pole of the elite is civil service and you've got the business elite, what's the place of the despised, the reviled PMC, professional managerial class in French politics? Because you could argue that they are relatively influential potentially in some other national contexts. What's your take on the PMC in France?
Well, if by PMC you refer to, let us say, urbanized middle classes or upper middle classes that have an outsized presence in, say, media, entertainment,
culture,
and so on,
broadcasting,
these people would be, I would say, a sub-elite in the French context. And although they are definitely very influential in setting the tone of public discourse, and have an influence on media discourse or broader, say, ideological trends in society, I wouldn't see in them a part of the truly incumbent elite. They're just under that level.
Okay.
And one thing about them is that they're numerically, they do not matter that much in electoral politics. So although they control some levers of influence enormously, such as the media, the levers of national level electoral politics, they control less.
No, I think I think there's something to that idea of a sub elite.
Plus, possibly in the French context, both the business elite and the administrative elite see themselves as very much above what you would call the PMC, and are somehow absorb PMC tropes and notions and agendas to a lesser extent, perhaps, than, say, in the US, where the Democratic Party elite is completely open to injections of PMC agendas in its own agenda. In France, possibly the upper reaches of the elite are somewhat more insulated.
Insulated sociologically or ideologically? Do they have
at all levels? I would say.
I mean, is this a result of a more
hierarchical society?
Yeah,
to be sure.
Okay, interesting. But I think to move on to the final part of the discussion, but the main man himself. So, I guess Macron, arguably the most significant at the time we're talking, the most significant politician in Western Europe. I mean,
that's flattering.
I said arguably, and it would have been Merkel previously, but if you're gonna write something about one politician who embodies all of the contradictions of a central European state and also has a massive influence on the EU. You know, he's on the short list, at least. Let's put it this way. But Perry Anderson, and you reference his characterization of Macron as an antibody of the system. What do you take this to mean? You say he's a neoliberal populist. Like, what is his significance? Is he the world spirit, not on horseback, but in the back of a chauffeured state car driving through Paris, avoiding being slapped by the citizenry, or is he a lesser figure?
He is his own trajectory and transformation is symptomatic of broader change of world historical significance, if you will.
Wow.
I would say that the whole point of one of the main points in that article is to start with Macron in his 2017 version, meaning an antibody of the system that emerges and blitzkrieg-like takes power by neutralizing whatever populist challenges arose at the time, or as say a neoliberal populist. And it's true that in his early years, Macron had a very clearly neoliberal policy agenda. To the new Macron, who emerging and transformed, often out of transforming himself out of political opportunism in the face of the Gilets jaunes, the pandemic, geopolitical turbulences, etc., emerges out of this as a president who no longer has the same neoliberal optimistic discourse that he once had, who is in fact might be a transitional figure towards more introduction of anti-establishment elements in the political system. So his own discourse would be itself, and his own actions would reveal a broader transition.
Yeah,
that transition would be from neoliberalism to something else that, for now at least, is no more than a very half-hearted neo-statism. And at the level of the distribution of power in society would be a form of renewal of elite classes by eventually the integration of some counter-elite anti-establishment elements within the ruling groups of society. So the thing with Macron is that, in a sense, Macron is a brilliant politician. He has proved himself to be a rather brilliant politician. And
actually, just to sorry to interrupt you, I just wanted to ask you about this point, because I do remember you making this argument to me quite a while ago, that don't underestimate his political skill. Is this the way that he's seen in France, or is he seen as a kind of? I think there is a tendency often to kind of to say, they're all idiots. There is a reason why, you might say, a structural reason why we have low quality political leaders. But I think it's often a little bit too easy to just say, these people have no political skill, because whatever their very real limitations would be, because of often their lack of organic links to social groups of any sort. Certainly they know how to play the game, and they make they must at least be selected to be able to make personal gain out of unexpected and challenging situations, because that's why they are where they are.
Yeah, well, this applies very well to Macron. I think Macron, is not broadly admired as a brilliant political operator in France, because very often people would tend to despise politicians that they also happen to oppose. So Macron is a very unloved figure. However, as a political player and as an operator in the political space, he has proven himself to be quite superior to his predecessor Hollande, who stumbled and fell and
destroyed his party.
Right. Whereas Macron, in fact, has been quite adroit in navigating turbulent waters of French politics, whether the Gilets jaunes or the pandemic or the Ukraine war and so on. He's someone who's has allowed himself to swerve to the extent necessary, not to be overtaken by events, or to come out of crises in a stronger position. However, one reason why he has been able to do this is precisely because he was heading a personalist political movement that would go in whichever new direction he would set. So, in a sense, everything is much easier if you are controlling a political movement or organization totally, as opposed to having to please or make compromises with various factions or orientations within your own party, which is obviously what happens in a more established party system like the UK.
Yeah. So I guess to wrap things up a little bit, the future post Macron, or even his immediate prospects. It's often, I think it's good to put people on the spot a little bit. If you have any concrete predictions at this point, anything that you want to go on record saying you think is going to happen or is not going to happen, so that you can prove the doubters and the haters wrong by saying, look, I said this at this point, and then we can we can try to re-edit the interview after it's released if these get falsified. Now, of course, we wouldn't do that. You've got to stand by your wrong predictions as well as your right ones. But yeah, what do you think the future holds for this world historical figure?
Well, I do venture and make predictions in the article, which is already putting me on the spot to some extent. But it's true. For instance, I am predicting some kind of amalgamation of rising anti-establishment counter-elites with the established elite. I think this may very well happen. But as for predicting who or which political force will indeed rise in the upcoming electoral cycle, that's just too hard. It's very uncertain. We just had an election in France. Yeah, there is currently a hung parliament, in the sense that the largest political group is the Macronist group. But who knows what parliamentary alliances might be formed in the upcoming years. One scenario that is relatively likely, and to which I would assign, say, a 50 or 60% chance of happening, is that Macron will dissolve parliament before the end of the parliamentary term, because the French constitution, which gives a lot of powers to the president, allows the president to dissolve parliament and call for an election whenever he or she wills it. So I suspect that if there is some kind of blockage in parliament going on, or if some political force, say France Insoumise or Rassemblement National, stumble for some reason or other and have a moment of being unpopular with the public, Macron could very well try to profit from this moment by dissolving parliament
and trying to regain his previous majority.
Right, that may happen.
Okay, I think that's sufficiently specific. I mean, yeah. In the article, I mean, this is the major prediction of importance, that the next stage of French politics looks to be some kind of amalgamation of those anti-establishment actors with some aspect of the current elite, which is I think that's an interesting note to finish on, because I guess it raises questions in other national contexts as well, like what are the I guess after the populist decade or the dangerous decade or whatever, what are the responses going to be of elites to the representative of the forces that were dissatisfied, that continue to be dissatisfied, that had been displaying their anger in the previous decade. But anyway, we could continue to talk on that for ages. So thanks very much for joining us, or joining me this afternoon.
Well, thanks for having me.
Brilliant.